Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Nazry Bahrawi. Dr. Nazry Bahrawi specializes in the study of texts, thoughts, and traditions of Indian Ocean cultures between Muslim Southeast Asia and the Middle East. His research is informed by decolonial theory, world literature, translation studies, as well as literary and critical theory. He serves on the International Advisory Board of Critical Muslim, a UK-based quarterly of ideas and issues, which presents Muslim perspectives on the great debates of our times. Dr. Nazry has translated 2 literary works from Bahasa to English by Singapore's Cultural Medallion winners, Muhammad Latif Muhammad's collection of short stories, Lost Nostalgia, and Nadi Putra's play Lorong Buakak. I apologize for my terrible pronunciation, the musical.
It's all right.
And Nazry has penned op-ed commentaries on identity, culture, and education in the Malay archipelago in Al Jazeera, The Guardian, South China Morning Post, The Straits Times, and Today. He's been interviewed by BBC and Al Jazeera. Okay, all right, so thank you very much to Nazry, and I guess we'll use this clap that way. Okay, all right, okay, the floor is all yours. Go ahead, Nazry.
Right, thanks, Jason. Can you all hear me okay? I hope if there's any problem, please just signal so that I can speak closer to the mic or something like that. So I'm just going to stop the video during my presentation and just so that you can focus on the screen. And then I'll talk for about 20 to 30 minutes. And afterwards, we can have a Q&A for as long as we want. We have about 2 hours in total. I hope that's okay with everyone. All right, I'll begin. So Jason, thanks for having me. Your module sounds interesting in that it places 2 concepts side by side, decolonization and gender. It is this perfect platform to engage with Tuck and Young's 2012 essay, Decolonization is not a metaphor, because one of their basic arguments there is about incommensurability, and that is the idea that 2 phenomena, or in our cases, causes, should not be judged on the same standard. Put simply, decolonization should not be equated to gender struggle. This is something we can discuss further later. So what I like to do today is to revisit Tuck and Young's essay from the discipline of Malay Cultural Studies, where I operate from. And I will do this by first giving a short talk before going into discussion, and I invite you here to share your perspectives later. My talk is divided into 2 parts. And the first longer part will see me revisiting Tuck and Young's essay by positing it against some basic arguments of decolonial thought from Kenya, America, and New Zealand. In so doing, I'll also touch on my essay about kampong nostalgias in Singapore, Malay prose, as an example of how I've tried to channel decolonial thought in my own scholarship. I think the 2 essays, this particular essay has been put up on the Facebook page. So in the second shorter part, I want to outline some thoughts about the intersections between decolonization and gender studies by referring to at least 1 scholarship from Southeast Asia. Are there any problems so far, Jason? And anything that I need to, technical that I need to consider?
No, I think it's going great.
Okay.
I think the speed is perfect, and I think we're all okay. If anyone has any issues, just let us know in the chat, okay? Thanks.
Okay. So I'll carry on. So before I move on into my 2 parts, I want to give a disclaimer. And that disclaimer is that while my presentation is part of my sustained scholarship on decolonial scholarship, it's still a work in progress, and my ideas here are not quite fossilized, but I'm happy for this opportunity to think through them, and I'm very open to your feedback, critiques, and reasons. Let's begin with decolonial theory. To understand decolonization, we must first have an understanding of colonization. We begin from the position that colonialism is not just about the hegemony defined by the imperial control of the material conditions of a society by a more powerful group. In their essay, Tuck and Young differentiates between 2 types of colonialism you see here on the screen. I've just reproduced them. The first being what they call external colonialism, and the second, the internal colonialism. And just to read quickly, external colonialism denotes the expropriation of fragments of indigenous worlds, animals, plants, and human beings, extracting them in order to transport them to and build the wealth, privilege, or feed the appetites of the colonizers, who gets marked as the first world. And we see here the idea of the division between the first and the third world being very much tied to the idea of colonization. Internal colonialism, on the other hand, refers to the biopolitical, geopolitical management of people, land, flora, and fauna within the domestic borders of the imperial nation. Related to their second point on internal colonialism, colonization has often been talked about abstractly in terms of trade, immigration, laws, policies, and international trade. In Singapore, we have seen historians take this evidence-based approach when dealing with the bicentennial commemoration last year. So if you're unfamiliar with Singapore's bicentennial commemoration, this is a year-long event dedicated to mark the founding of modern Singapore from the landing of British imperialist Stamford Raffles in 1819, somewhat relegating anything that's transpired before that year as not modern or primitive. Colonization in Singapore is viewed largely positively, with one senior civil servant describing it as, quote, 60% good and 40% bad. So disagreements among scholars. So I've put here a picture of what could transpire. This is a statue of Raffles in Raffles Place, City Hall, where you can see that Raffles is still standing tall, right? And you can kind of compare this to Cecil Rhodes' statue, or the movement Rhodes Must Fall, that happened in South Africa and then move on to elite colleges in America and elsewhere. And with the bicentennial, the thing to remember is that the statue of Raffles does not have that same like-minded movement to try to bring him down in a kind of hashtag Raffles Must Fall, but a group of people that are commonly associated with a critical humanities group have thought about this notion of Raffles must roll, which brings about this notion of a kind of metaphorization of challenging colonization. I will talk more about this later. So colonization goes beyond mere fact. It's an experience that is deeply embedded in culture, and this has ensured that its effect continues till today. That is to say, colonial hegemony exists in the realm of the abstract, in art, poetry, beauty, philosophy, thoughts, and languages. This is the point made by the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his seminal 1986 book, Decolonizing the Mind, when he talks about mental control. And he says here the real aim of colonialism was to control the people's wealth, what they produce, how they produced it, how it was distributed, to control, in other words, the entire realm of the language of real life. Colonialism imposed its control of the social production of wealth through military conquest and subsequent political dictatorship. But its most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized, the control through culture of how people perceive themselves and their relationship to the world. Economic and political control can never be complete or effective without mental control. To control a people's culture is to control their tools of self-definition in relation to others. So Ngugi wanted to resist that mental control and decided then that he would make several changes to decolonize his own mind. He changed his name from James Ngugi to Ngugi wa Thiong'o for starters. He started writing in his native language, Gikuyu, though he had also translated his own novel, Wizard of the Crow, from Gikuyu to English, which is an interesting move that we can discuss later. Still, the basic point remains: colonization is cerebral. It occupies our minds, our languages, and the way we imagine. Here you can think about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in linguistics theory that states that the way humans think about the world is influenced by the structure of the language that we speak. Some languages are gendered, such as Arabic or French. Others are less gendered, such as English and Malay. And if you're a movie buff, the logics of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis can be gleaned from the 2015 Oscar-nominated Alien movie, Arrival, based on a short story by the contemporary Chinese-American sci-fi writer, Ted Chiang. The hegemony of the abstract realm means that we collectively live under an unequal system that always privileges certain individuals over others. Beyond ethics, and in the realm of art, this also means that we live in an uncreative world because we all accept one standard measure of aesthetics. This is another reason why Ngugi thinks we must decolonize. In essence, Ngugi is encouraging us to think of decolonization as a metaphorical struggle of the abstract realm. How do we square this with Tuck and Young, who hold the very strong position that decolonization should not be a metaphor? Doing so, they argue, will diffuse the true purpose of decolonization, which is to give back the land to the indigenous peoples. It is important to remember here that Tuck and Young is talking about contemporary America, a white settler colony whose liberal settler folks are equating and equivocating decolonization as something akin to other social justice struggles, including gender equality. These, they think, will not change the system and may even be harmful to the true purpose of returning lands to the indigenous peoples there. And coming from the Malay archipelago, this experience is not commensurable. Singapore, for instance, is not a typical settler colony. It is unique in that the Malay minority subjects are both indigenous and settler. Its majority Chinese subjects did not come as colonizers, but as a social collective, they do display instances of privilege. And we have talked about in Singapore, the term that has become popular is the idea of Chinese privilege. The nation state has also continued colonial strategies of racialization in managing their citizens, just like the British colonizers before. In other words, in the case of Singapore, where colonization is cerebral and hidden, there is value in positioning colonization, in positioning decolonization as a metaphor. And this is exactly what I've tried to do with my essay on kampung nostalgia in Singapore Malay prose. My essay looks at 4 Malay novels about Singapore to argue that the contemporary appeal among Singaporeans, especially policymakers, to uphold the idea of a pristine Malay past is expressed as an uncritical fascination with the kampung or Malay villages. In fact, I showed that this nostalgia is fueled by the racialized colonialist idea that Malayness equates to rusticity, untouched by progress brought on by British colonization, a very bicentennial idea. Today, it has become commonplace to think of the kampung spirit as something to be celebrated. Here, I'm giving you 2 examples of how the kampung spirit has channeled itself into modern life. This is a book that has won a literary prize in Singapore called Kampung Spirit, Gotong Royong. Gotong Royong basically is Malay for different communities coming together to work hand in hand to overcome struggles. My own university, SUTD, has tied up with HDB, which is the Housing Development Board, to try to create a new urban kampung. So what you see here is this example of trying to bring back the rustic past to try to make it relevant to modern times. In my essay, I outlined that this modern optimistic idea of the kampung spirit is an empty signifier and a form of cultural appropriation that can be likened by the colonialist idea of the noble savage, who is to be commemorated within terms familiar to the colonialists, or in our context today, the neo-colonialist, especially we're talking about Singapore. In this essay, I have exercised the technique of metaphorizing decolonization, but I do not think that it deters it away from the decolonial agenda. The essay speaks metaphorically of the workings of neo-colonization in Singapore, even though it may not result directly in the returning of the land to the indigenous, as what Tuck and Young suggest that it should do. As I've mentioned, indigeneity cannot be singularly defined. In the case of Malay Singaporeans, they too were settlers at certain points in the past, though they were indigenous to the region. Their indigeneity is tied to water bodies as much as land. The Malays were sea-born people used to traversing the straits and the seas of the archipelago. In some sense, Hong Kong too is a kind of island that is somewhat affected by its proximity to water bodies. And it's really interesting to look at the parallels between maybe Hong Kong identity in relation to water bodies as opposed to the land itself. And when we talk about land, of course, we can think about the big mainland, which is mainland China, right? So an important book to read here is Decolonizing Methodologies, published in 1999 by Maori Professor of Indigenous Studies, Linda Tuhuai Smith from the University of Waikato. And I'll explore here what she actually says. Smith is particularly wary about romanticizing the term indigenous. She writes that the term indigenous is problematic because it appears to collectivize many distinct populations whose experiences under imperialism has been vastly different. For her, it is important to pluralize this term such that we must talk about indigenous peoples with an S. But what is it that links this disparate group. She writes that the world's indigenous populations belong to a network of peoples. They share experiences as peoples who have been subjected to the colonization of their lands and cultures. I would add here water and the denial of their sovereignty by a colonizing society that has come to dominate and determine the shape and quality of their lives, even after it has formally pulled out. We have heard briefly from decolonial scholars residing outside of Asia, and what I would like to do next, maybe soon, is to try to look at Southeast Asia and one work from there. But before I do that, I want to introduce another basic point of decolonial thought that has also been addressed in Tuck and Young by referring here to the writings of Walter Mignolo, an Argentinian semiotician and literary scholar at Duke University. Mignolo is interesting in that he comes from Argentina, so he comes from the global south, but at the same time has a position at Duke University, which is in the global north. So he occupies that strange interstices between the north and the south, and some of his scholarship has been criticized as coming from a position of privilege. This is something that we can discuss a bit more, but for now, the idea that I want to bring to you is this notion of a crucial difference between what is post-colonialism, which I see as an established field of study, and decoloniality, which is still emerging, and this is what Mignolo himself said. While acknowledging that the two deal with the common concerns of colonialism, colonial legacies, and coloniality, Mignolo argues that decoloniality has to be perceived as an epistemic and political project. This means that its aim is to disengage from an established set of thoughts, theories, and hypotheses drawn from Eurocentric theories of knowledge, such as modernity, development, and globalization. Post-colonialism, on the other hand, is more often seen as a disciplinary field of study, but instead of disengaging from Eurocentric knowledge, post-colonialism draws from it. And how is that so? Mignolo demonstrates this by engaging with Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, or the tendency to reductively represent Orient cultures, mainly Arab cultures, as other to Europe. Orientalism is based on Said's study of the cultural products of British and French writers and painters of the 18th centuries at the height of their empires. Mignolo counter-argues that the same logic of cultural stereotypes can be traced earlier to the 16th century with the Spanish and Portuguese discoveries of the West Indies and the Americas, or the New World, a venture which he calls Occidentalism. For Mignolo, both Orientalism and Occidentalism assume the existence of monocultural units, with Mignolo going as far as to speculate that post-colonialism is ironically imperialistic in essence. He warns that if indeed post-colonial theories claim globality, if not universality, it may be problematic. For such a claim will reset the imperial pretensions that post-colonial studies critiques imperialism for. It would become an imperial design as any other. This is a very strong critique. In using the phrase imperial design, Mignolo is referring to the danger of dogma, or the insistence on replacing one totalizing mode of thought with another, colonialism with post-colonialism. This is overzealous to him. For Mignolo to say that post-colonialism is the exclusive solution to address the colonial matrix of power is no different from the modern colonial way of framing the issue. Both eliminate alternative possibilities. Mignolo says that post-colonialism presents a complication since the non-West can only disentangle itself from the discourse produced in the West by relying on knowledge and paradigms produced by the West. Would this then truly constitute decolonization? To avoid the charge of dogma that troubles post-colonialism, Mignolo stresses the need to approach decoloniality as an option. The point here is to offer yet another possibility of decolonization, one among several options that is informed by the unique histories and thoughts of non-Western cultures. This stands in opposition to articulating a history of how the non-West collectively had reacted to European colonization, whether this is in the form of rejecting or copying the former colonizer. So what he's really arguing for is that you cannot look at the non-West as one major monolithic unit in how they respond to colonization. Indeed, theorizing, so as an example, Mignolo believes that it would be more productive to look for what he calls alternatives to modernity rather than to theorize alternative modernities. So to theorize alternative modernities would draw from the same intellectual framework that informs Eurocentric modernity, suggesting that doing so will not likely yield any radical options. All this goes to show that post-colonialism is not the empowering discourse that its champions hope the non-West can embrace. In fact, it may even channel the same tyrannical features that fueled colonial modes of thinking in the first place. One of those structures that post-colonialism reproduces is the subject-object dichotomy, and this is a central paradigm of Eurocentric modernity. And this is traceable to the Cartesian cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I am the subject that observes the world, and I construct reality from my own vantage point. Mignolo writes, post-colonial studies and theories as institutionalized through US academies and ex-Western European empires fell back on the epistemic frame of Euro-centered modernity. The distinction between the knowing subject and the known subject is implied in both the notion of study and in the notion of theory. Gandhi, Fanon, and Ansel Dua did not study or theorize British imperialism in India, Black experience in Caribbean, Berber experiences in North African or Chicana experiences in the United States. Their political stance went together with a decolonial shift in knowledge production, the shift we are conceptualizing in terms of geo and body politic of knowledge. What kind of knowledge for what and for whom? This really brings us to reflect on basically the function of the university in a society and the kinds of knowledge that positions us in rankings, university rankings, for instance. What kind of knowledge are we producing and how are we trying to please or climb up the ladder? This suggests that research itself is colonized, going back to what Gugi says about culture and language. It is an important point for those of us concerned with the business of making sense, of meaning, reading, interpretation, and translation. Tuck and Young makes a similar point to differentiate the two. In fact, they argue that post-colonialism does not attack the systemic inequality, but just substitutes one agent for the other. They write, oh, sorry about that. I'll just read out what Tuck and Young write. They write that an anti-colonial critique is not the same as a decolonizing framework. Anti-colonial critique often celebrates empowered post-colonial subjects who seize denied privileges from the metropole. This anti to post-colonial project doesn't strive to undo colonialism, but rather to remake it and subvert it. They also write that the post-colonial pursuit of resources is fundamentally an anthropocentric model, as land, water, air, animals, and plants are never able to become post-colonial. They remain objects to be exploited by the empowered post-colonial subject. So what you see here is just a substitution of the person at the top. The colonial subject is now substituted with the empowered post-colonial subject. So if in the past it was white folks or settler colonialists, today it could be brown settler colonialists or Chinese settler colonialists or neo-colonialists who occupy that position. So the system remains, but and nothing really fully changes. This kind of substitution is not always material or obvious. My essay on Kampung Nostalgia suggests it can also be metaphorical and thus require an equally abstract response. So in the interest of time, I want to outline some basic points about the intersections now between decolonization and gender by referring to a recent work of decolonial scholarship from Southeast Asia. You see here on the screen that book. This is Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, published in 2018 by Said Farid Alatas and Vanita Sinha. They are both professors at the National University of Singapore, and the book draws from their experience teaching a basic sociological theory module. They realized that all the theory they taught in that module were from dead white men, Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, and Karl Marx, for instance. In the book, they made an effort to try to dig deep within Asian cultures, to try to look for alternatives to non-Western sociological thinkers, not to displace the work of Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, but to complement them. What is more important in this book is the assertion that the colonization of the mind, of knowledge, as demonstrated by them through classical sociological theory, is not just Eurocentric, but androcentric. That is to say, it privileges men over women. This is a direct connection between decoloniality and the gender struggle. To write against colonization is also to write against patriarchy. It is a struggle for all of us, white, black, brown, men and women, they write, in drawing attention to neglected thinkers, male and female, Western and non-Western. We argue that the tapestry of contributions to social thought and theorizing is multifaceted. A pulsating, synergized, and complex history of the discipline would emerge in the recognition of diverse inputs by thinkers from different cultural contexts. And the aim is to expand the playing field rather than to restrict it. One can ask, or one can revisit Tuck and Young's doubt. Does this equation between decolonization and gender diffuse the struggle against colonial hegemony? I would argue that in the case of Alatas and Sina's scholarship, because they are careful not to replace colonization with feminism, I see it as an argument of parallelism rather than substitution or subsumation. In this instance, decolonial scholarship can be metaphorized. To summarize, decolonial thought in both Asia and other parts of the non-West seems to share the following principles. Colonization is not just literal, it is also abstract. As an abstract concept, colonization refers not to the facts of European colonization, but to what it represents. Right, namely the hegemony or dominance of one form of knowledge over many other forms of knowledge. This means that we need to be aware of power structures. Decolonization necessitates an understanding of gender dynamics. Because it is not literal, even countries that had been colonized can experience the effects of colonial hegemony. I didn't go through this book, but one book that really matters here is Kwan Sing's Asia as Method, when he talk about the Cold War. We can talk about that later. And to pursue a just world, a diverse world, and therefore a more creative world, we need to decolonize epistemology or knowledge systems. In other words, we need it to be a metaphorical struggle. While decolonizing, we must also be careful not to fall into the same trap of constructing generalizations such as all Europeans are the same or all indigenous peoples are the same. We must not substitute it to other struggles for social justice, though parallels can certainly be drawn. So I know these points may sound didactic, but I'm hoping that they are not. I'm hoping that they can be seen as generative instead. I think I'll end here and look forward to our discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Nazry. What a great talk. I'm really thrilled, especially because I feel like you're really speaking to what we're going over in this class. So I have a few notes and some responses, and I think you did a really good job of summarizing in the end. So I'm just going to kind of pick up from where you left off about this question of are we being overly didactic? You know, why is it so important to understand that decolonization can be a metaphor? And that if we only think of it literally, that perhaps we're doing something like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. At the same time, I don't want us to be, putting up a straw man and saying that, obviously it's, obviously decolonization does take metaphorical, stances, especially when you're looking at, epistemology. However, I think that this gets to the kind of critique that I'm trying to make. It's that Tuck and Yang seem to be only speaking to a particular kind of cultural context, which is the American Academy, and specifically the use of this word decolonizing in social justice movements that are not actually, doing the work of decolonizing. And so really, even though it might really work for their context, especially in the American Academy, it strikes me as another form of sort of American exceptionalism. Whereas the political struggle, in the American Academy is said to be kind of representative of everything. And, where Tuck and Yang, their kind of decolonial project might only be specific to the United States or North America, which is something that is troubling. So I'm wondering if you'd like to talk more about that, especially what you think Malay Studies, and your work on the Bahasa phone maybe has to add to our understandings of decoloniality.
Right. Thanks for that. I'm thinking that maybe I can take related questions to what you just mentioned on didacticism and cultural context. Yeah. If anybody wants to, yeah.
So, so now everyone feel free to chime in. So anyone who has a question, please, go ahead. I don't know what the usual way of doing this is in Zoom.
Yeah.
So I guess just, I don't know, just turn on your video and ask a question if you have a question.
Right.
Anyone? Or maybe what we can do is, Nazry, maybe you can start answering that first question. And anyone who wants to ask a question, maybe once you type in the chat box, and then we'll say, okay, next question will be from so-and-so, and then we'll give that person their time. Is that okay with everyone? We can do and maybe let's move to speaker view. So let's turn off your screen and just have our video faces. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
oh,
great.
Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you. Yeah.
Great.
So anyone else who wants to turn on their video and join in the conversation, please. Okay. All right.
Okay. Thanks, Jason. Yep. So I'll just respond very quickly to the two questions, and I think I'll go first with the notion of cultural context. It's really important to recognize the specificity of decolonization, of decolonial struggles, and talking about Malay studies, and I'm specifically coming from Malay cultural studies. There are very interesting parallels at work here. In Singapore, the Malays are thought to be minorities, and like I mentioned in my talk, they have not always been an indigenous community, right? A population. In fact, if you go back further, the Malays themselves could even be seen as settlers, right? And so it complicates this notion of what Tak and Yang was saying to be settler colonialism, right? And I think you're right about pointing out the specificity of them talking about the Western, basically American academy, and how decolonization has been subsumed under this wider need to try to talk about social justice, right? And I think I think, in fact, I think what they are really saying is an important thing. I think it's necessary for Tak and Yang to be saying that, but like what Walter Mignolo is saying, you cannot try to generalize a theory that came from a certain specificity to try to talk about everything, this notion of globality or universality of decolonization or post-colonialism. Not decolonization. And so decolonial has that opportunity to recognize the cultural specificity. And I am, in fact, very much agreeable to Tak and Yang's article, but I just think that it could be taken in a way as to try to be generalizable to other contexts. And I think that is where it kind of falters, or where it's flawed. So in terms of didacticism, so basically, if you don't know the meaning of didacticism, I'm sure everyone does. I'm just going to revisit the word here. It means that it's moralist. It's a kind of moralistic stance to try to get you to think like me, right? And there's only, put it very simply, there's only one way to go about doing things. And the very spirit of decolonial struggle, if we really go down to the nitty-gritties of decolonial struggle, is to go beyond this notion of dogma, which I mentioned earlier. What Mignolo is saying is that not so much to talk about alternative modernities, because modernity is kind of like that de facto word that we all need to struggle, but alternatives to modernity. What are the different other systems in which other societies have progressed in the modern world, right? So I don't know if I'm making sense here to you, but I'll try to keep it, make it simple as much as I can.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's a complicated answer, yep. Right? That's what we're at. That's really what we're trying to do, is try to understand the nuance. We do have a question here from Professor Gina Marchetti. Gina, do you want to ask it? Okay, I'll ask it on your behalf. So, and this is in the chat, so you can look at it. So this is from Gina. Sure. I have a question about feminism and decolonization. I'm not sure all efforts to attack patriarchal power necessarily also attack colonialism and imperialism. In fact, certain forms of women's empowerment have shored up colonialism. Could you talk more about this?
Great. Thanks so much for that question. I think it's a really important question, because in this question, we need to, again, go back to the notion of specificity. So I'll keep it very simple. The idea of what is the ideal women, or what is the ideal situation for gender equality to exist, right? In Muslim cultures, this might be very different from what we might consider to be, as opposed to, say, America, right? In certain Muslim cultures, to put it very simply, and I hope I'm not being reductive here, to dress in a certain way would be seen as empowering to women, and that means wearing more clothes rather than less, right? Whereas in Western cultures, in certain ways, this might be the total opposite. The empowerment of women to the point of gender equality might be to, say, free the nipples, right? And this is not something that will work in a Muslim culture. So certainly, yes, the idea of cultural specificity and the idea of different sets of values that form a society is really important in trying to recognize what decolonization means to different cultures. And I hope I'm making sense there.
Yeah. Okay, great. Other questions?
I mean, if somebody else wants to go and talk further about this, I'm really happy to listen. Yeah.
We can think of this as a kind of a group discussion too. So if anyone else wants to chime in with examples or anything to discuss. Okay. Well, while we're waiting, I have another kind of, I don't know if it's a comment, but more of a question too. I'm really interested in your, actually, okay, we have a question from Priyanka. Priyanka is asking, how is indigenization different from decolonization?
Right. Thanks. Yeah, these are two big words, right? I didn't quite touch on indigeneity here, but I've talked a lot about decolonization. I think to try to think through what the indigenous, the concept of indigeneity kind of entails, I can only do that from my perspective of Malay studies. And in Malay studies, indigeneity is a very complicated idea in which it can at once be empowering. In the case of Malaysia, the Malays account as the majority of the population, but always feel like they are not the majority, even though by numbers they do make up the majority. So that complicates the idea of indigeneity. So their way of trying to be empowered is to try to channel indigenous thoughts. So they've outlined things such as the Bumi Putra policy, which basically means promoting Malay's kind of like entry into economic power, right? And so what happens there becomes the idea of a kind of manipulation of what is thought to be indigenous into something that is thought to be quite tyrannical. So you get something like the phenomenon of Ketuanan Melayu, which translates as Malay supremacy operating in politics, right? And so you get majority Malays talking about empowering the Malays when in fact they are already large by numbers, right? And so so there is a complication of indigenous thought there. So I'm just saying it's very difficult to try to kind of like, for me, at least from Malay studies, to pin indigeneity. And this is one of the projects that I'm thinking about. How can indigenous studies and Malay studies kind of speak to the larger indigenous studies as curriculum as it's been out there? So yeah. So the other thing that I brought up, I think in my talk, was this notion of how the indigeneity can be defined from oceanic kind of imaginaries rather than land, right? And this is also a concept that I'm really interested to explore further. I've only just begun talking about it. So again, going back to the case of Malaysia, Malaysia's indigeneity or the Bumi Putra policy includes both the Malays, but also the Orang Asli. The Orang Asli are indigenous folks who are usually land-based agrarian indigenous folks living mostly in the jungle, and they are not Muslims. They are sometimes Christians, sometimes just native into their religion, right? And so this is interesting because according to Malaysia's constitution, and Bumi Putra is defined by what is usually defined by the Malay subject, and the Malay subject is usually defined as being Muslim. Again, the notion of indigeneity is complicated by the idea of the land being formative in their thoughts. I think. I mean, I'm still thinking this through, so I'm happy to hear thoughts on it. Okay. I don't know if I've answered it actually.
Yeah. So we have 3 questions. So that's really great. So let's start first with Corey. Actually, Corey, would you like to ask the question yourself, or do you want me to read it for you?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Are you in the MRT, Corey?
Okay, all right, I'll read it for you. Okay, Corey, thanks. Okay, so this is from Corey. Hi, everyone. I'm on public transport, and it's really noisy, so I'm not going to turn on my audio. But Nazry, thanks so much for a really great lecture, and Jason for hosting it. Minolo and Walsh are also very careful to emphasize decoloniality as an option rather than a militant set of rules or structures, which I appreciate. I want to come back to Chen Guangqing's Asia as method. There's been a movement, which I do consider myself a part of, to consider Southeast Asia as method, and how Southeast Asian countries and regions can take each other as reference points in developing theory. But my struggle is with the construction of the Southeast Asian imaginary and how it may enshrine certain kinds of nationalist or nativist ideologies, or end up producing a set of rigid essentialist traits. What are your current positions and perspectives on this?
Yep. Yeah, so Guangqing's book is really interesting. Why I brought up Guangqing's book was really to talk about his idea of de-Cold War, and that idea of de-Cold War suggests that, you know, it suggests a kind of metaphorical colonial continuity, right? Because it doesn't mean that a country has to be colonized for it to feel colonial hegemony, right? And this idea of de-Cold War, and he's really talking about a place like Japan, and Korea, if I'm not mistaken, or perhaps no, I cannot remember which East Asian country he was talking about, but a country that has not gone through colonization, but still feel today the idea of the Cold War, right? Of a kind of colonial hegemony. I just wanted to say why I brought Guangqing's kind of scholarship into my talk. But then this idea of Southeast Asia as method is interesting, and the basic issue there, as Corey has pointed out, is the very idea, what is Southeast Asia? And I was very careful today to try to position myself as a Malay studies scholar rather than a Southeast Asian studies scholar. And that's because of the very idea of how Southeast Asia cannot be generalizable, right? And so how do you then think about Southeast Asia as method? And this is a movement that it's a movement that requires you to kind of to generalize, and to generalize beyond basically the basic fractures within Southeast Asia. For example, maritime Southeast Asia, which actually refers to the Malay world, as opposed to mainland Southeast Asia, which refers to more Buddhistic notions, Buddhistic societies, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, stuff like that. What is that lowest common denominator that links all these countries together? I'm not so clear that Southeast Asia as method, or I'm not so positive that Southeast Asia as method can be an intellectual framework. I think that what we should be doing is to recognize spheres within this idea of Southeast Asia. And that's where I want to talk about the Bahasa Phone. You asked me about my Bahasa Phone. My project is to try to recognize a kind of cultural unit that exists as one one structure, right? And I think the Bahasa Phone, just like the Sinophone, can be one such unit. It's not talked about in Western Academy so far, but I do think that literatures from Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and Singapore that uses different dialects of Bahasa, and here we can even think whether Philippines could be part of that Bahasa Phone in terms of Tagalog as a language, or is that different, right? Could be part of that sphere. And I think this is the problem that I'm also struggling with. But right now, my position is that Southeast Asia as method is not something that I would personally be in favor of.
Okay, great. Well, we have quite a few questions, so let's get through them. But just a note too, you know, like if we're talking about decolonizing, right? What is the common factor with Southeast Asia? And you have to think a lot of it is colonialism, right?
Yeah, that's quite true.
Yeah. All right. So
with the exception of Thailand, Thailand has not colonized. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Sandeep. Sandeep, do you want me to read it, or do you want to ask it yourself? Okay. So I will just read it for Sandeep. Okay. Yeah. So let me know if you want me to read your questions, or or if you want to read them yourselves. Okay. We're happy to all get to know you. All right. So this is from Sandeep. I have a question about the cerebral and hidden functions that make the Singapore context interesting, especially how it then positions the question decolonization as metaphor. How do you think the Singapore context as a non-settler colony or not an anti-colonial nation position decolonization in an important way? And can this be extrapolated to other contexts?
Right. Yeah, I'm just reading Sandeep's question again. It's a complex question that I'll try to address. And I'm happy to hear your own ideas as well. I don't want to be just the one talking. Yeah. So I would like for this to be a discussion as well. So I think when I think about Singapore's context and the decolonization that should happen here, practically, but also in the academy, I think that it should happen only here. And I'm really, again, very careful not to try to generalize it to other contexts. And so I would say I would start and dig deep into the idea of Singapore's colonization. One of the things that makes Singapore unique is this notion that colonization is to be celebrated rather than to be chastised, right? And that's like I said, the senior civil servant said 60% good and 40% bad, right? And I would like to try to understand the kind of historical conditions, the kind of cultural conditions that led to this sort of thinking. And I think that sort of like conditions that led to this sort of thinking has to do with notions of progress and development, right? And how Singapore has been positioned as the model third world to first world country that other third world nations should follow, right? And how that has benefited the nation state in some ways. And I think that is the very interesting feature of Singapore's decolonial movement. Why hasn't decolonization really taken root in Singapore? And I think there's this huge system at work that prevents it from taking root. And that's because economic imperative has been put has been foregrounded much more than any other kind of imperatives. And generally people here in Singapore feel that they are well taken care of. And so they have given up certain, not values, I would say, but certain features over others. And so I think it's I think that's the unique situation about Singapore, what the economic imperative taking over everything else. And I think that, I mean, in my essay about Kampung nostalgia, what was interesting was that Kampung nostalgia has also channeled itself or fit it into ideas of the smart city. Singapore is crazy about smart city now, but in this pursuit of smart city, notions of Kampung nostalgia, Kampung of the notions of gotong royong, right? Just now I said that gotong is that communal spirit of coming together, still matters, right? And so this is a kind of cultural appropriation that is subsumed under a bigger economic imperative. So yeah, I would answer it that way. Do you have any thoughts on your own, Sandeep, about this?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thanks very much for a very interesting talk, Nazry. And
thank you.
I think I was particularly fascinated by the idea that you're reacting in terms of these kind of I think the idea of the hidden functions and how actually decolonization can work as metaphor in the Singapore context. So I was just thinking about your article on Malay writing and kind of linking it to that broadly. That was the imperative a bit behind my question.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. Yeah, I understand it better now.
Okay, Sam, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Which is good because I have the typo in it. So it was mainly to do with how I may have misunderstood you, but I thought you were saying that changing epistemic models to include or center indigenous knowledges was metaphor, like making decolonization a metaphor. Was that I understand you that that's something you were pointing to as being metaphorical?
I'm saying that it's abstraction, but in trying to make it abstract, it has to use a metaphor of the mind and decolonizing the mind. Of course, decolonial has always been thought as a material thing, but the mind is thought to be something a bit more abstract. This is what I'm trying to say, I think.
But I thought that an epistemic model would be a reparation of Indigenous life, which is what Tuck and Young point to as being exactly what decolonisation is.
Mm.
And they, in contrast to their ethic of incommensurability, where they see, things that aren't actually decolonisation pretending to be decolonisation. It seems that changing epistemic models is really decolonisation, at least as they understand it, and
Right.
that the metaphorization was more about pretending that other things were. I just wasn't quite sure that we were being as charitable to Tuck and Young as we could be.
Right. Yes, I think you're right there, and I think I remember reading that Tuck and Young basically says that they are not trying to clamp down on this idea of decolonizing the mind. In fact, I think what they talked about was this, the two thinkers, right? Paulo Freire and Frantz Fanon, if I'm not mistaken, kind of like positioning them against each other to try to talk about decolonizing one's mind, right? Yeah, you're right there. I think that what they're saying is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that they are not saying that decolonizing the mind is a bad thing. They're just speaking against this notion that to try to equate or equivocate decolonization to social justice struggles is not exactly decolonization. I think I also said that in my talk. I recognize that they are doing that and that they're not necessarily saying that it's a bad thing. But I'm also, what I tried to say in my talk is also that what they are saying could be taken, not necessarily their intention, as a generalizable thing that could be applied to other decolonial struggles elsewhere. And what I was trying to do, maybe I'm still trying to, I'm struggling with trying to talk about this, is that in the context, at least Malay archipelago, decolonization as a metaphor is not a bad thing. On certain instances, talking about equating the notion of, say, the kampong spirit, right, which is a kind of metaphorical concept and an abstract concept, to decolonizing epistemology is not totally they are not totally opposites. Have I answered your question, or?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
I mean, yeah, we can talk further. I mean, I may not have answered your question properly.
I think one thing that kind of can help us think this through is your differentiation between land and water.
Okay.
I think that's really helpful way to think about it, because my sense of the Tuck and Yang is not so much that there's something wrong with metaphor. It's that it needs to be tied to something material. It needs to be tied to a material activity, a political activity that leads to material resource allocation. And for me, when I read that, like, that makes a lot of sense, right? It's like, put your money where your mouth is, right? There needs to be materialist in some sort of way. But at the same time, I think that what you're pointing out, with this talk about water, versus land, is that even this notion of materiality being the primary is also part of colonial thought, right? The idea, the notion of owning land and property itself has kind of, or this idea that, you're choosing between Marxism or socialism and capitalism is also part of colonialism, and for some groups, not all, they could be considering that as part of a colonial move as well, which I think that, Tuck and Yang kind of brush over a little bit in this insistence on the materiality. But I don't know if I'm, overly generalizing or simplifying that too much.
Yeah. No, I think you put it really well, Jason. I mean, in terms of like just talking about this. So like the idea of materiality, and I think here we can go back to the what Nolo said was alternatives to modernities and alternative modernities. And of course, modernity has a set of principles that come along with it. Ideas such as materialism, kind of progress, decolonization, not decolonization, but all these other things. So we're still operating within the sets that are subsumed under the big idea of modernity. So
See, for me, like when I hear metaphor, I think imagination. I think, comparing, in an abstract way. And I think that imagination does matter. Now, can imagination be materialistic or materialized? Yeah, I think so too, So I just think it's complicated. But having such a kind of a sensational headline like decolonization is not a metaphor, already leads us down this kind of path of oversimplifying, but
That's
I kind of like your answer. Like, it can be a metaphor. It's not always a metaphor, which I think maybe is more useful. Yeah. Okay. Albert has a question. Albert, do you want to ask it yourself, or do you want us to read it out?
Okay, I'm trying to unmute myself here. Can you all hear me?
It's working. Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. I guess my question here, going back to what Jason just mentioned as, the idea that we're trying to also look at the way in which we put material processes aside. And perhaps sometimes if we look just at the rhetoric and semantics upon which we actually construct this grand narrative, because I think there's, I'm interested in this idea that we might need to think about the possibility of disentangling ourselves from some sort of a grand narrative here, because I think towards the end of the paper, Tuck and Yang's paper, they suggest that, if we're to answer questions of reconciliation, where they said answers will not emerge from friendly understanding and indeed require a dangerous understanding of uncommonality that uncoalesces coalition politics, moves that may feel very unfriendly. But in a way, if we're to understand decolonization to be a challenge that doesn't just work at material levels, but also semantic levels, are we also looking at kind of deconstructing this and metaphorizing this? Because I think we're actively engaged in looking at, say, things like progress, and also, for example, they said, okay, well, the lack of fluency, for example, in land and indigenous sovereignty. Are we looking at transcending these categories, these native categories, in trying to understand, or perhaps to, allow for this new grand narrative to emerge through this kind of a discourse of decolonization here?
Right.
Are we trying to make way for that? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'll try to reinterpret your question and to see if it makes sense. Basically, what Tuck and Yang is saying at the end of the essay is that decolonization should be unsettling rather than complementary, right? Complementing or easy, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not quite, I'm just reading the last line here, decolonization is not an and, it is an elsewhere, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just, I've been thinking about this a little bit, and maybe in trying to talk this through, I could be addressing some of the points that you raised, but you can always dive in, right?
Sure. Yeah.
I think there is a sense of a kind of utopic idea or utopian idea of what decolonization entails. I say utopian because utopia has been described as a nowhere, but also an elsewhere, right? A better place, but one that requires a kind of different imaginary. And what I think Tuck and Yang was really trying to say in terms of what they mean by being unsettling is that it cannot be familiar to what we already know. That doesn't mean that everyone, somebody has to suffer. Suffering is certainly entailed in this notion of decolonization, but certainly decolonization also entails a kind of human flourishing, which is very utopian in its very essence, right? And to be utopian in this thought, in a revolutionary sense of the word utopian, rather than the idea of utopia as not achievable, is to try to look for new features, right? Features that we're not familiar with, that we don't know about. And so this is where the unsettling part comes in, I feel. Is that notion of looking for alternatives to modernity and starting from scratch the very idea and challenging the very presumption of what modernity is, or should we even talk about modernity, or let's talk about something else, things that are material versus cerebral. This could be also concepts that we are already used to, and so by talking about them we think that we are actually changing the vectors of things, but we're really just reproducing it, right?
Yeah.
So the question for me is when do we know that we have actually moved to this notion of an elsewhere? How do we know that we have thought about something that is different, that is actually truly decolonial? And that is very hard to gauge, because I think everything is somewhat related, and that this idea of a meta-narrative is still at work. How do we know that we've really fully gone beyond this idea of a grand design and then move into something totally new? I mean, the very idea of democracy is what everyone is talking about, right? Even Islamic societies talks about aspects of democracy. How do we know then that we have moved beyond ideas of democracy and then truly free ourselves? This is a problem for me. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's a problem for everyone. Okay. Other questions? Anyone?
So I'm really talking in very abstract terms, but my basic point is really, how do we know, right? That when we have moved beyond, that this is the beyond that we are at. Yeah.
Well, maybe we can, I want to leave the floor open for some more questions, but, you know, well, while we're waiting, you know, I just want to say, Nazry, thank you so much for joining us today and giving this great talk. You know, this work sounds really important, you know, and I really feel much smarter after listening to your talk, so I really appreciate it. I guess maybe another question we could ask is, you know, how do you see yourself kind of, you know, what kind of argument do you see yourself making if you kind of turn this kind of talk that you've just given us into a kind of argument, you know, a larger argument you'll be making for either, you know, your agenda in the Bahasaphone, or, you know, kind of advocating for more ways of thinking about decolonialisms. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So I'm very inspired by the work that Vinita Sinha and Syed Farid Alatas has done, which is the one that I pointed out to. So they start from a position of recognizing an issue or a problem, and then try to, you know, look at alternatives to that issue. I don't know if they had gone to an elsewhere, as Tak Ken Yang talked about, but they certainly have gone somewhere, right? And so how I see my work moving into this through the Bahasaphone, and the idea of a Bahasaphone really is to try to break that notion of Southeast Asia, is to look at what could be dogma and decolonial framework, indigenous framework, is not really just about trying to recognize the less powerful, the unacknowledged. It's also about trying to shift this notion of what we have been so used to, right? That utopianism that I talked about, right? And I think to try to pursue that utopianism, you cannot say that you'll definitely get there. And this is the problem that I have, is to try to, is how do I know that I'm actually doing true decolonial work? I wouldn't say that I'm doing true decolonial work, but I'm at least trying to use the method of what decoloniality entails in my work. And that is to look at alternative possibilities to what we have or we're so familiar with, right? To try to change the vectors just a little bit to see where we can where we can go with that, right? And so I think that idea of Bahasaphone challenges the vectors that already exist, vectors of the Sinophone, the vector of Anglophone, Francophone. Nobody really has talked about the Bahasaphone. What does it mean to theorize the Bahasaphone? And this is what I'm very interested in. I consider that decolonial because it, like I said, it's a utopian framework that tries to challenge a kind of dogma that already exists.
Okay. All right. So we have a message from Professor Marchetti saying many thanks to Nazry for a stimulating discussion.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments, feedback? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Bahrawi, for a fantastic discussion and a great talk.
Thank you,
so,
Jason.
yeah, and I have recorded this, so I'll be posting it. So if any of you want to look at the transcript again or reread it, you know, we'll post it online. Okay. All right. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you later. Thank you very much, Dr. Bahrawi. Okay.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.